This is White Line from Deuces Cracked.
And this is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com.
And this is going to be episode 4 of our series PLO. In this series, I have a pre-recorded video of a match that I played against Huck Seed on Full Tilt at 5-10 heads up PLO. And I've picked out some of the more interesting hands, and I'm going to go through them with Phil, and he's going to provide me with some advice.
Cool. So this is the first hand. I'll just start it up. You raise King 7-5-4, pretty standard. This is pretty early in the match, correct?
Yeah, I think we'd been playing for maybe like 10 minutes before I started recording. And I mean, no real specific reads, but he doesn't really 3-bet much, and he plays very aggressively, is what I've gotten out of him so far.
Cool. So you check on this flop, and I just wanted to stop real quick to say this is a very standard check and a good check that I think a lot of people don't make. You have a wrap, but if you get check raised, you're in really bad shape. Either, you could be up against a set and then you're basically flipping slightly behind, but against like a higher wrap or straight draw with a flush draw, you're just in terrible shape. And it's not really like a hand that, I don't know, it's a hand that you can play a lot of turns pretty well on. So I definitely check this back almost always. You turn the second nuts, and he bets into you. So what are you thinking at this point?
I think he's going to be betting this turn with a very, very, very wide range of hands. Lots of 2-pair. I think he expects me to fold a lot here on the turn. And I also feel like if I raise, he's going to call a lot with a bunch of those draws, a bunch of those straight draws plus pairs, all of like flush draws, and pretty much the only hand that I expect to get re-raised by here is going to be the actual nuts, because I can definitely have the nuts here. So I think it's a pretty easy fold if he re-raises, and I think we get some value out of him calling with a lot of draws and worse hands.
I agree with everything you said, but I think there's a little more to it. I think that you're right, and this isn't a spot where people are going to 3-bet you light unless they have like set plus flush draw or like open ender plus 2 flush draws, something like that. So I'm not really worried about getting blown off the best hand too often. But even though you're getting called by a lot worse, you put yourself in a really tough spot on the river because you've kind of over-upped your hand, which is not a terrible thing, but it's going to be tough for you to get value on the river. Let's say like a deuce rolls off. He checks, you bet. I think he's going to have a really tough time calling you with much of anything. Another problem is he could have a hand like 7-9 and just call the turn, and then I don't know how tricky Huck Seed is, but a lot of players will do that if they just have like a bare 7-9 here. Call the turn and check raise a blank river. But the other problem is if you do get called by 2-pair or, open ender with a flush draw or something, I think it might be literally like 70% of the deck on the river, you won't have the nuts anymore. Something like, I don't know, 45% of the time a flush hits, board pairs, higher straight draw comes in, something like that. So to raise this turn, you have to be really confident in your read on your opponent, because what he'll do a lot of times is call with a draw or like 2-pair or set or, combo draw, something like that. And then if he hits, he'll lead into you. If he misses, he'll lead into you some of the time. And you can make some hero calls if you think somebody's bluffing too much. But to raise in a spot like this, I'd have to be really confident that either my opponent has a leak where he just doesn't bluff on rivers, or has some bet sizing tells where he bluffs bigger or bluffs smaller than he value bets. Things where I'm confident I can make a good decision on the river. Because this is a spot where you kind of put your hand face up, though it looks like you have 7-9. And yeah, a number of river cards roll off and he's going to bet into you. And I guess, so like if a 9 of spades comes on the river, he leads into you, you have to fold. and I think that's just true of a lot of river cards. So as it played out, actually, he three bets you, and you pretty quickly fold, which I think is the right play. But I guess the main moral here is, even though on the turn there are a ton of hands you get value from, I think it's important in PLO to look at how future streets are going to play out. And I think this is a spot where, though you in some ways got away cheap, probably against 7-9, and found out his hand right now, and you do get called by a lot worse hands, the river's just going to play really, really poorly for you, which is why this is a good spot to raise like a big combo draw, and then have him lead into you when you hit the nuts. All right, so here you pick up 8-6-4 deuce, raise button. I've noticed that your c-betting sizes vary. Does it have to do with board texture?
Yeah,
More
board
than
texture, and I guess how deep we are sometimes, but for the most part, just the board texture in single raise pots.
Yeah, cool. All right, so you continuation bet the turn or flop, pretty standard, and he pots into you on the diamond turn with how much behind? You're pretty deep. I guess I should, if we're going to talk about it, that means obviously something's about to happen, besides you folding. But you go ahead and consider a raise and do it. So what are your thoughts in this spot?
I think on the flop, his check calling range is going to be very wide. Pretty much any king, any flush draw. I think he might even peel with like a hand like 8-9, 10 jack or something like that. So I think he's calling really wide on the flop. And when he leads pot on the turn, I think his range gets kind of polarized because I find that a lot of players with like medium flushes or even like smaller flushes, are not going to play it that aggressively and just pot out on the turn and then go for like another big bet on the river. I think most of them just check there to try to exercise some pot control. So I really think he can only have like the nut flush here. And even if he has like a smaller flush, there's also some chance that he either folds it now or possibly on the river. Although I'm pretty sure I'm just going to bluff this one street. If he calls here, I'm going to shut down on the river. I don't think I'm going to try to bluff him off what's very likely to be a flush at that point.
Yeah, I thought I was gonna have more to add, but that's pretty much what I was thinking. I think he's really polarized here, and when he check calls the flop and this turn hits, probably like, I don't know, 20% of his hands are flushes, and maybe a much smaller percent are ace high or king high flushes. He check raises a king high flush draw on the flop because it's top pair, at least most of the time. So yeah, I think when he's leading, it's really just a factor of how often he's leading with one pair. And if it's like even like 10% of the time, then he's going to have air most of the time just because of how often he has air or one pair compared to a nut flush. And I definitely agree that I wouldn't barrel this river having raised the turn. The one problem you get into is that he could possibly have like a king XXX with the ace of diamonds lone. I don't know if I guess he'd probably make a move here, given that it's pretty unlikely you have anything. But again, I think that doesn't happen enough either, and you're risking 420 to win like 280, and I think you're going to make money on this bluff. And he thinks for a little bit and folds. I guess that was just him thinking about being mad and then fold. So you raise the button. Pretty standard with king 8-7. Pretty standard with most hands this deep. You check back the flop. It's not the most interesting street in the hand, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think in this match he's been peeling the flop kind of light, and I feel like this is the type of flop that's gonna hit like a reasonable amount of his range. I also completely missed this, so I just checked.
Yeah, it's not like you have any real equity when called, and you're gonna get called a lot. So I agree. I just give up on this board. It's important to give up sometimes, more often in PLO than in no limit, just because it's too likely somebody has a hand they can peel with, and it's tough to want to like commit multiple barrels with no outs effectively. So he checks you on the turn, and you go ahead and pot it. We have an open ender now. The jack isn't great for us, but anyways, yeah, I think it's pretty good bet. And ace hits on the river, and you have to decide whether to bluff or not. So, what are your thoughts?
Once he checked the turn, I think there's just a very good chance that he's weak, and we can definitely rep some sort of hand that we turn, like King Jack or Jack 8 or something like that. So I decide to bet. When he just calls, I think he's reasonably likely to have like Jack 10 or Queen Jack or like some hand like that where he has a pair plus a draw. He could also just have like a pair flush draw or something like that. I think he's weak is basically the main point
Yeah,
that we can
exactly.
get from him check calling the turn.
Yeah, the ace is actually a good card for you. I agree that he leads most of his straights on the turn, like almost always. I think King Jack he's leading and Jack 8 he's leading. So when he check calls, I think he has a lot of two pair or combo draw. So like Jack 10, Queen Jack, Jack 9, or like Queen with clubs, or like a gutter with clubs. Some like King 9 with clubs, something like that. Anyway, so all his straight draw missed. His two pair is now not looking that good unless he had an ace with it, because now ace 5 beats him. Not that you'd be value betting ace 5 here probably, or he'd expect you to, but it's still like his absolute hand strength has gone way down, and that's tough for some people to get past, even if you're not going to be value betting all those hands. So the ace didn't really improve any of his hands; it hurt most of them, and I definitely agree with the bluff here. And you did, nice hand. So he raises the button. I think pre-flop this is a little bit too loose. Just the cards are a little too low. Move them all up like 3 cards and it's standard. But even with connected cards, one suit, a low suit, and just like your straights aren't going to be good. Your two pairs aren't going to be good. And here you have two pair. You lead the turn. I think you could check call just because it's nice to have some hands in your check calling range. Most people don't have very many on the turn when the flop gets checked through. Usually their turn check means they're check folding. But that's more about like balance metagame. In a vacuum, I think I usually would lead this. And he raises pretty quickly and pretty big. I guess that's pot size raise. That's pretty weird. What do you put him on here?
I mean, I found this to be kind of weird too. I didn't really expect to ever get pot raised here on the turn once I bet out. I mean, I feel like he's probably got some sort of a draw. Like the only made hand I can really see him doing this with would be like 6-6, maybe ace-6. But I mean, we have a 6 in our hand, so like those two hands, I guess, go down a little bit combinatorically. Mm-hmm. So I think he's got like a big draw here, a lot, and he might even have a good amount of equity against us. But I still don't think folding would be right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're beat here, it's either because A, he checked behind a hand on the flop that was really strong, which is really unlikely, or B, he improved to one on the turn, which means 6-6 or ace-6. Maybe he could have a hand like ace-6, 7-8 that he would raise the turn with, but I don't even think he's raising just a dry ace-6. I don't know, it's a tough spot because, I mean, you have bottom 2 pair, which is a really weak hand, even if you are ahead right now, which I agree you likely are. Your equity is never that great. I don't know, I agree that you're almost always good here, but it's going to be really tough to play the river unless you feel you've like a good handle on your opponent. If he is like a really good hand reader and like good aggressive player, that's going to make it tough for you on rivers. I think you have to fold here, even being almost sure you have the best hand. If you think that he's not going to bluff enough rivers, kind of like we talked about before, or just is going to give something away, I think it's an easy call. But anywhere in between that, it's pretty sticky. Just because, I mean, we could run some equity calcs. I'm not totally sure, but even against just a pair and a flush draw, like a 9 and a flush draw, you're in pretty like not bad shape, but not great shape. And river's going to be tough for you. So you call, and the river's a 4, and he checked it down. And he did have a draw, not even that big of a draw. And this is one of the better hands he could have been up against, just because, I mean, his only outs are 9s, 8s, 7s, 5s, and 10s, and even that's kind of a lot. But, I'm curious as to whether he would have bet like a club river. This is one river that I'm actually a little surprised he didn't bluff, given that he's got the 7 blockers, and he's obviously doesn't have the best hand. So I think given that he checked this down, I'd feel comfortable calling the turn and folding almost every river. But yeah, against a tougher player, I think you get in a lot of really tricky spots here, and you might just have to fold the best hand on the turn. So you 3-bet with King 10-9-9 with a suit. I think it's a little bit too loose to 3-bet out of position. I'm really tight 3-betting out of position, more tight than most, but the 9s just play really poorly for you, just because a lot of times you'll flop like one pair, top pair, middle pair, and then just you don't have a lot of 2-pair outs because you have one less card. Like a hand like King Jack 10-9 or King 10-9, even King 10-9-7, I think plays a lot better. But I'm really tight out of position with 3-bets just because of how much I hate playing out of position. So you go ahead and c-bet half pot. What are your thoughts on the sizing, or why do you bet half pot?
It's just an overall game plan thing. I think on most flops, it's just the amount that I'm going to be betting, considering we're only 100 big blinds deep, because when I have a made hand, I can still get all in by the river pretty easily, and I can bluff for half pot when I have a bluff in this spot.
Yeah, I agree with it. I think these are flops that miss people a lot, and it's going to miss you a lot. So I'd just rather bet small so that I can take it down most of the time. And if he does make a move, you still kind of have room to do something about it if you bet small. Obviously not when he pots it like this, which I think, yeah, that's pot size raise. But in general, just betting small on dry flops is what I do. I'll do it on boards, on paired boards, on 3 flush boards, and on a lot of different 3 straight boards, depending on where the cards are. So he pots it and has maybe 500 behind. I think you probably just have to go with this hand. It's good that you have a king high flush draw. Had you had a 10 high flush draw, it would have been a much stickier spot because I think he has to draw a lot of the time here. But likely your king high flush draw is the best flush draw. So even if you are behind like jacks with a flush draw, your equity is pretty good. You have the gutter too. His raise, I think, is interesting. His raise size. They're not really. I wouldn't raise to that size with any hand. Not that I think it's necessarily bad, but as part of an overall game plan, I just think there's not really a need to. I'm trying to think of a hand I would. Like a hand, if he has like a nut flush draw with a gutter, something like that, that has some merit to raising this size. But even then, I'd rather raise smaller and let you like reship. A hand, let's say you had a hand like this, but without 2 9s, just like a bare king high flush draw. I'll let you reship that. So I think that my standard would just be to raise smaller with everything. So like my raising range on the flop would be most 6s, like kings or queens with clubs. Maybe some like weird, like if I slow played aces and had a gutter here, I'd probably raise call it off. He folded, which is really, really interesting. It would have been less interesting had he had he snap folded, but he tanked, so I guess he must have raised. I don't know if he would raise a hand like dry queens there, or maybe raise like an open ender and then think he's not in good enough shape. I don't know. But anyways, back to what I was saying. So I'd have like any 6. Those like kings with clubs, hands like that, and then just my total air. And when you bet 90, I'd raise those all to maybe like 250, 260. And then there'd be a lot of hands that I'd call with. I'd call with most of my flush draws, most of my straight draws, wraps, things like that. But yeah, I think the play on your part, besides preflop, which is a little iffy, is standard.
What's like the weakest hand that you would call with in his spot here? Like if you had a hand, let's say as weak as like you'd be like King Queen 9-7 with like backdoor spades or something like that. Would you be calling a hand like that on the flop?
And I had already raised, or I had not raised.
No, you had not raised, just facing the initial half pot bet.
Yeah, that's a hand I think that's clearly good enough to call. I'm going to peel a lot because since you're going to be c-betting half pot with most of your range, and I think you are out of position, and I get to see how you react to a lot of different turns. It's pretty unlikely that you have a 6, not super unlikely, but you have a lot of high card hands, and so like an open ender is more than enough. I'd even float a lot with like a Jack 10 9 4 with spades. Maybe even Jack 10 9 4 if I thought like I had a good read on you and how you played turns. But yeah, I'd be calling pretty wide here, and I think that's the correct adjustment to people betting small. A lot of people react to small bets by raising a lot, and I think that that sometimes plays in their hands because they get to bet small, then you commit a lot of chips and before you know anything about their hand. So I'd rather call and see a turn for cheap. So you raise the button, Queen 8-8-7 with a suit. You flop gutter and second nut flush draw. If your flush draw was weaker, I'd check behind here a good amount of the time, but you want to get value from worse flush draws, worse like wraps, things like that. And even though this is kind of a sticky spot here, I think since you have the second nut flush draw with your gutter, you can rep some like you can rep if a 9 hits because you have blockers. 8's probably good, not necessarily, but probably. And you're in position. I think you can call here, which is why I think you can bet. What do you know about his like flop tendencies? Pot seems to be his default size when he makes raises, but about his range.
Right, he's been playing pretty aggressively so far. I mean, he hasn't been playing like a maniac with his flop check raising, but he's definitely been check raising a good amount.
Is he? Do you think he's the type that would check raise a hand like Ace, King, Jack, 6 with no suits?
I think it's definitely possible. I haven't gotten to showdown enough with him to really know if he's the type to like just check call with like a hand like that, but it's definitely possible.
Okay, and what about do you probably tough to tell, but is he always 3-betting his aces pre-flop?
He's only 3-betting 10%, and I have not gotten to showdown in a 3-bet pot with him where he was 3-betting, so I don't know if he's the type where that 10%, half of it's just going to be aces, or if it's the type of person who's only going to 3-bet like super premium hands, so only like double suited aces, so it's really hard to say right now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we call, and obviously the best turn in the deck, and he checks to you. So now there's 450 in the pot, 775 in stacks. It's kind of a weird spot, just in that it's not too much missed. Basically, all that's missed is the 7-8-9, and the straight draw came in, the higher wrap, and the flush obviously hit. And it looks like you're going to go ahead and check. What's your reasoning for that, I guess?
I mean, thinking about it, I would definitely bet this if I had to play it again. I feel like if he has a small flush, with like some straight draw or something like that he check raised on the flop, or like 2 pair plus a flush draw, I think he's pretty much gonna call at least one street here on the turn, and possibly the river. And we have more than a pot size bet left, so to get all of his money, we'd have to bet here, because he's never gonna check raise like a small flush or anything like that. And he could also have like a set here, and there's a good chance if we just bet something like 275 or whatever, he's going to check call with his set, trying to let the board pair. So, I mean, if I had to play this again, I would definitely bet here. But I mean, reasons for checking would be if I thought he was bluffing on the flop, to let him possibly fire a bluff on the river. I mean, other than that,
Yeah,
checking just does not seem very good to me here.
that's definitely a lot of what it comes down to is how often he's check raising the flop with air. And then how often he bets the turn with that air. I think that there are people that would check raise a flop with whatever, like 10-9-7-5, and then check the turn, but then when you check behind, realize that you don't have a flush very often and bet the river. So if you think he's bluffing a lot on the flop and can do some bluff on the river, that's one argument for a check. Obviously, checking behind, I'm all for mixing up your game and deception. You could find yourself in spots against a really tricky player where river bricks off, he checks, you bet, and he check raise bluffs because he knows you can't have the nuts. But yeah, I agree that he'll have some sets here, and even a hand like Ace 10 that won't call a turn bet, in a pot this big, it does hurt you to give him a free card to hit his 4-outer. So I think overall a bet is best, which it sounds like you agree now. But you went ahead and checked. And you hit your straight. And yeah, this is a spot where, like, really, really nothing's missed. Obviously, you value bet the nuts, but I don't expect to get called that much here. I would actually consider here making a smaller bet in hopes to induce a bluff check raise. So just something like 225, and because it does look like he either has air, maybe like an Ace 10 or Ace 6, something like that. You could get a crying call from tens. I don't know how strong a player he is. If he's like not a great hand reader, you get a crying call from tens if you bet small. But yeah, I think I'd like a smaller bet. Just the off chance you get a crying call, and then the off chance he check raise bluffs you. I also, this is the best bet against a flush, obviously, but I think that he would lead a lot of his flushes on the river, putting you on a straight most of the time. And it looks like he had a little decision, but decided to fold. So probably a decent hand reader. But yeah, I think we both agree betting's like the standard turn. Obviously, I would check behind some percentage, but pretty low. And then had I checked behind, I think I'd use that deception to my advantage and go for like a bluff induce. Alright, so here you're on the button with Ace 9, 4, 3. And you get 3 bets. You get 3 bet. You said he hasn't been 3 betting that much, correct?
No, 10%, which is very low for heads up PLO against some of the players that have been playing.
Okay, cool. So a pretty good flop for you. Nut flush draw and a pair. So we're obviously not folding. Really, I think this is a standard, just standard shove. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about why, because I know that a lot of our audience is new to PLO. So I guess what are a few reasons that you would shove here as opposed to calling?
I mean, mostly just to protect. I mean, not protect. I guess that might be the wrong word for it. Mostly just to get him to fold a bunch of hands that might have good equity against our hand, and also to prevent ourselves from making an incorrect fold. We want to be able to see both the turn and the river here.
Yeah, I mean, there's already a lot of money in the pot compared to stacks. So, and he could have a hand like, I don't know, like Ace Queen Queen 5, and just pop the flop because that's what he does. I don't know whether that's true or not, but he'd probably fold a hand like that has some equity against you or decent equity, a hand that you want to fold. There also if he does have a hand like dry aces, he might be able to get away from it on a heart turn. He could also get away from it on like a 7 turn, which might be an argument for calling and bluffing straight card turns. But I think overall, just the pot being this big, you just have to go ahead and try to take it down. And the other thing about it is, if you did start calling hands like this, if you called all your draws, then people would be able to just really confidently bet fold a lot of hands against you. Where I'd rather put them in a really tough spot if they have a hand like, let's say, Ace Queen Queen, or even just dry aces. Once he pots, he has to get it in here with dry aces, but yeah, you should have a range where he's making a pretty marginal play at that point, which he is, and unfortunately you miss. So you raise the button with Ace Jack 10-7, Jack high diamonds. It's a pretty good flop for you. I think a really standard C bet. And you hit your flush right away. So I guess our options are bet or check. We can worry a little bit about sizing, but I don't think it's a big deal. And I guess the question is what kind of hands he has, what our image is in this spot, and how light we think he'll call. So we're really just wondering if we can get two streets of value here. If we think we can't that often, is it a better option to bet and then check, or to check and then bet? So what are you thinking here?
I think his range on the flop is again going to be very wide because he's been peeling a lot on the flop. I mean, on the turn, I mean, he can definitely have two pair or flush, and I think there's a good chance. I mean, he's pretty much always going to call a flush, I think, if I bet. And if he has two pair, I think there's a good chance he might call one more time. And if he has a set, I think he's definitely going to call twice here.
Yeah. I think one extra argument for betting is that the nut flush draw is also top pair. So, and a lot of those like card combos come out to having like top pair nut flush draw and a gutter, or like something like that, to where he would usually be check raising the flop. So I don't think he has a nut flush draw all that often. So if you take out some of his nut flush draws, you really only lose to two hands, and you can get two streets of value from, I think, almost any flush. I assume you're playing. It seems like you're playing pretty aggressively, and he's making some pretty thin calls too. So I think this is a hand you can get two streets of value with. Another option against somebody who is, I don't know, really readable, I guess, because there will be people that would check call, check raise the river with, nut flush, or sometimes with like ace of diamonds alone, they would check call or check raise right now, which is one problem with betting. But against somebody who's really kind of readable, you could check back the turn and value raise some rivers depending on how large they bet. I think some people are really exploitable with bet sizing tells. But yeah, I don't know whether Huck is or not. So I think the standard is to bet, bet, bet. What is the worst hand for value you would 3-street here?
I think this is probably it. If I had like a 10 high flush draw, I think I might bet here and then check the river. I think that's probably what I would do.
Yeah, I think I like that too. A little bit better than checking and then betting the river. For a couple reasons. First of all, this is a turn that I'd like to barrel because I think he does have a lot of like king, queen, jack, or just ace, XXX that'll fold the turn. So I want to have some thinner value bets in my turn range so that I can bluff more. And so I think I would definitely bet the turn with a 10 high flush, maybe even 9 high flush, and then check down the river. Maybe most flushes and then check down the river. But obviously you have to mix it up. So you do go ahead and bet, which I think is the right play. And on the blank river, you just follow through with the plan to 3-street. And he calls. Do we get to see his hand or no?
I think he had a 9 high flush, actually. I remember checking
Oh, wow.
when I played the hand.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of suck that you have 3 diamonds in your hand and one of them's the 10. So that's one, the next best hand that he can't call you with. But I think he will be calling with all flushes there, and you do get value from a lot on the turn. And you hear from, I really like that expression, but you hear from bigger flushes on the turn a lot of the time. So I think that's a pretty good bet that some people are afraid to make.
One question on the flop. You said that a decent amount of the time he's going to check raise the nut flush draw because he's going to have top pair also, and a good amount of the time he's going to have like a gut shot or something else with it. Mm-hmm. Don't you think that is a hand that might be a good strong hand to have in your range to just check call the flop with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. On a board like this, you definitely want to have some of those hands in your range. I think what I would do is check call with like just ace X of diamonds with nothing else. But like ace king 10 with ace 10 of diamonds is such a strong hand. and you're going to peel with so many worse draws, like if you have a wrap or like pair and a lower flush draw, that he just dominates. And those are hands against which you want to build a really big pot, because it's going to be, even though you're out of position, it's going to be fairly easy to play on later streets. And if you can get the pot up to like 350, 400 by the turn, and then you hit flush over flush somebody, it's a good spot to make a lot of money. I am all for balance, and I'm glad you brought that up, because you do want to have some stronger hands in your check calling range, and I would occasionally call with a really strong hand or a really strong draw here, as I would with sets and things like that. So yeah, I would do it some of the time, but my standard would be to check raise. Most of these hands are you on the button. It's nice because they're easier to play. All right, so really dry flop, and you make your smaller size c-bet, which I agree with. And he calls pretty quickly. So here's your first, I guess, decision. You turn an ace, so you have ace-king. The 5 helps you a little bit just because you have blockers to a boat, and also if he does have a 9 here, you have 4 outs. Although I guess you still had 2 outs, but now you have a couple extra outs. You check behind. What's your reasoning for checking behind?
When he check calls the flop, I think the biggest part of his range that I put him on was like an overpair, like tens through kings, something like that. And I mean, if he has hearts with that, I guess he's gonna have like a few more outs. But in general, I don't think he's gonna have many outs when we're ahead. So I don't think we have to bet to protect our hand. And I don't think like he's very likely to peel with that hand on the turn here. So I don't think we can really value bet here either on the turn.
Yeah, a bet is definitely not a value bet. A bet here is, I guess, like a protection bet, in case he does have a hand like 6, 7, 8. I mean, it's kind of a value bet because he's calling, I think. But against a hand like jacks or queens, I think he's probably folding. And you don't want to give him 2 free outs, but that's not a huge deal at all. I guess the question is how you think he'll play certain rivers with those hands. If you think you can get value from them on like a brick river if he has jacks, either by him bluffing or him check calling. But you go ahead and check, which I think is fine.
Yeah, I was pretty ready to snap him off on like a blank river if he bet out, because I expected him to bluff with those overpairs the way the match had been playing. He'd been playing very aggressively.
Okay, cool. I would expect a lot of people to just show down like jacks or queens, but I definitely wasn't. I wasn't playing him. You were. So I do believe there are people that would turn those into bluffs. Do you think he's floating the flop with hands like Jack 10, 7, 8?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. He plays the flop pretty loose.
Yeah, then I think that's one more reason to check back, because I think if he's floating with that, he's going to bluff the river. Obviously, this is a really bad river card for you. Flush gets there, backdoor flush, but you have 4 cards, so he could have it. And straight hits, so if he did have a wrap or just like a gutter, some of those hit. He bets 70. So I guess a lot of this comes down to his tendencies as far as how thinly he value bets. What do you know about that, and what kind of hands do you think he could value bet here?
I mean, because he only half pot, I think he could probably value betting as little as trip 9s here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. My first thought was that he wouldn't value bet 9s here, and that he might value bet a 7, 8, but might not. And then obviously value bet a flush. But I thought he would bet I'm thinking a boat or a flush, he would bet bigger. So I put less weight in that part of his range. So I'm really worried about a 9 here and the 7, 8. So it's a matter of, how often he would bet with those hands, if he would bet at all, which I think he probably would, especially if you think he would. And then how often he would turn a hand like jacks or queens into a bluff here, or just like a jack 10, 6, 7, I guess, which is a gutter that missed. You are getting a good price, but I don't know. I think that hoping he has jacks or queens or like the 6, 7 float, and also being that like 7, 8 was a big part of his floating range that hit, and that it's pretty easy for him to show up with hearts. I would go ahead and fold, I think. I am a station, but I think you can make the fold. You do have blockers to a boat, but this isn't really a spot you can bluff raise, given that you just can't rep it unless you have like 6-6. So yeah, I think that was a well played hand, and you could consider betting a turn for protection, but given that you think he's floating wide on the flop and going to bluff rivers, I'd just let him bluff, but that was just an unfortunate river. So you raise the button with 10-7-6-5 and get a pretty good flop. You'd rather it not be two-tone, but two pair and open ender is great. So it's a pretty standard bet. And that is your normal bet size on draw your flops, which I agree with. And I think same thing on the turn. On both the flop and the turn, you'd hate to get check raised, but at the same time, you're strong enough that you can call, and there's so many worse hands that can call your bet that I think it's mandatory value bet on both streets. So queen to it's not a great card. And he pots into you. So obviously we have a bluff catcher now. So how, I guess, given your reads on him, what do you think he's doing this with?
I mean, he's definitely capable of bluffing. He's been playing very aggressively, so I mean, any hand that he called a flop and turn with, like any sort of flush draw, or straight draw plus flush draw, pair plus flush draw, anything like that, he could definitely decide to turn to bluff when the queen comes. He could obviously have Jack 9, but I think the one thing here is I'm pretty sure the only hand that he's going to do this for value with is going to be Jack 9 when he just pots into me, because I can definitely have Jack 9 here that I bet on the flop and turn, which is probably the reason that I ended up calling here. I think I went into the time bank or something.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That like your absolute hand strength is not that great. You have like middle two pair, where anything like queen deuce, queen eight, etc. all beats you. But he's not betting any of those hands. Be an interesting spot for him to lead into you with a hand like queen 10. That'd be like an advanced play that I don't think anybody does at all, and you'd have to have specific reads that your opponent's pretty cally to do that. But yeah, I definitely agree that Jack 9 is the only hand that beats you. So it's really a question of how light he's peeling flop and turn, and how often he's bluffing with those hands that miss when the queen hits. Like if a 9 hits, I expect him to bluff more, like with everything that missed. But at the same time, that hits like a lot more of his hands. So that'd be a tricky spot as well. This is a queen I think doesn't hit as many hands, but because of that, people don't bluff as much. So it's really just a question of your read on him and his frequencies. And also, if he's capable of turning a hand like 5-8 into a bluff, or I don't know, Jack 10-9. And so it looks like he is capable of doing things like that since he turned his kings into a bluff, which really skews it towards a call. If he's capable of turning made hands into a bluff, that really skews it towards a call, just because that just is so many more hands in his hand range that you can now beat. I don't hate his play. It's just a question of what he thinks of you and how he thinks you'll view him. But yeah, the other thing to think about is that Jack 9, while it's very possible, he also would check raise that some percentage of the time. So that takes a few combos of that out. And I agree with your call, and you're right. So you raise with ace-6-5-4. And inside to check back this flop, I think it's a good check back. Just because you're getting played with so much and you can't stand a check raise, you can hit some cards on the turn that improve you to a pretty strong hand, so I'd rather just take a free card. He checks the turn, and you go ahead and pot it. I think this is... It really depends on him, but this could be a losing play just because, given the board is so drawy, I think he's just peeling really light with a lot of even like Jack 10. um, hands might be calling here. And so it's really just it's a question of how often he leads the turn with all the hands he's going to play. And on a lot of boards, I bet a lot of turns because people check fold turns a ton because they just lead the hands they want to play. But this is a board that I think there are too many hands he can have an excuse to call with. And so I feel like if you're going to bet here, I don't know, you might have to bet some rivers a lot just because of how weak he is. It's kind of interesting. And you go ahead and check. So what do you think about this as a bluff spot?
I mean, looking at it again, I think probably should be bluffing here. He's very unlikely to have a boat. I think most of the two pair hands he probably just bets on the turn, just to take it down, because I'm very likely to be folding there. I guess not so much on the turn because I could have a bunch of draws that I did not have on the flop that I improved to on the turn, but I still expect him to just bet two pair on the turn, so I don't think he's gonna have a boat here. He could definitely have hearts, plus some sort of straight draw or pair, something like that he check called with. He could definitely have like a random eight in his hand for trips, and I'm pretty sure he's going to call with a flush every time. And if he has an eight, I think there's a good chance he calls with that too, but I don't think he's going to call with a weaker hand than that.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty iffy spot. Either way, I think is fine. I mean, like we said on the turn, he's going to be calling pretty light, we expect. It's kind of a thing where he probably doesn't have a very strong hand, but it's hard for us to rep a very strong hand. Like 10-9 was a credible hand on the turn, but we're not value betting the river with 10-9. We didn't have two pair on the flop. We could have had 8-4, but he probably doesn't expect us to have two pair on the flop. So the only boat we have is queen-queen or queen-8. And then just the hearts that we might have picked up on the turn. So it depends, if he's willing to make hero calls with like ace-jack here, or, ace-queen or king-queen, whatever. And if you think he's not, I guess it's a spot where you need to bluff just because of it's more likely that he has a hand like that than having a flush or a trips or a boat. But if he does sometimes make hero calls with like king queen here, then I think it becomes a losing bluff.
Yeah, I don't think I'd run any sort of a big bluff on him. I'm pretty sure he hasn't caught me bluffing anything other than maybe just like barreling the turn and then giving up on the river or something like that. So in terms of metagame, I think a bluff is probably pretty good here because I don't think he's going to call me very light.
Cool. Yeah. If you have the precedent set up where he's not going to hero call that much, then and maybe even consider folding an 8 here, then I think it definitely turns it into a bluff because of what you said, that him not having too many boats in his range, and maybe he might lead turn with hearts a lot too. So I think it probably would have been a good bluff given all that, and I guess he probably would have folded that hand, hopefully. So you call in the big blind with ace-10-6-6 double suited. And you flop two back doors. Pair of sixes. I think this is a spot where you could lead sometimes. It really depends on how often you think he's going to be raising a lead, which if you haven't really set up a precedent of leading a lot, I think he might bluff raise a lot, which would make it a bad lead. But otherwise, my standard here is to check call. Given that you have two back doors, sixes might be good. You can rep a lot of hands. But he checks behind. Good turn for you. So you have the 6 blockers and the nut flush draw. This is pretty much a standard bet for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the standard play here is definitely to bet. But I actually think it'd be a really cool play to check raise. I think that he checks behind with a lot of like 9x or I don't know, like 7s or whatever, something kind of weak or some air. Probably not too much air. But the really cool thing about this hand is you have the blockers. So anytime you have blockers, it's nice to be able to rep like nuts, like exactly nuts, to get the most fold equity. So like when you're betting here, you're repping a pretty wide range of semi bluffs and value hands. Whereas when you check raise, you're repping air or the nuts, and I think you can get them off a lot of hands that way. It just looks really strong. And another really great benefit about doing that is that if he does call with like a flush draw or two pair, and you hit your nut flush on the river, you can either bet weak and get bluff raised, or check raise against a flush or a bluff. And if the river bricks off, I'm always betting, having check raise the turn, and I think you get a ton of folds that way. So I think it's just not a line people take all that much as a bluff. But the standard is to bet. I would bet that more often than I would check raise. And so then on a brick river, the question is whether to bluff or not, and you go ahead and bluff. So what kind of hands do you put him on, and how much respect do you think you get here?
I think his turn range is gonna be pretty wide. Pretty much any five plus like a deuce tray four or an ace, I guess, which is a straight. I think is gonna call the turn. Any spades, I think is gonna call the turn, like spades plus a nine, something like that. Any two pair, I think his range on the turn is gonna be really wide.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And this is a good river for you. It bricks all his like 5-4 type hands. Also, if he did have a hand like 4-3, it brings that hand down in absolute strength just because it's an overcard. And you could even if and he could have a hand just like sevens and call the turn because he doesn't believe you, and probably have to fold this river. And like you said in the last hand, you haven't shown down many bluffs, so I think this is a pretty easy bluff spot, a very good bluff spot, and it works. So it's kind of a quick hand, but I think interesting to talk about. We raise the button with double suited king 10, 8-6, and flop pretty good. We have a 10 high flush draw, a pair, backdoor flush draw, gut shot, and bet 50. And we wanted to talk about whether to check back or not if this is the kind of board you check back. So I guess, what do you think are some benefits to checking back as opposed to betting?
I mean, we only have a pair of eights here as like our made hand, and on this board, I think he's very likely to fold a jack if he doesn't have a 9 or a 10 to go with it. He's probably going to fold like an overpair too on a board like this, I think. So I mean, we just get him to fold a lot, and if he check raises, I mean, we have a hand that's strong enough that we can at least call one street. I guess other reasons for betting. I mean, checking back, the good thing about this hand is that we have a backdoor flush draw, we have a pair, we have a gut shot, and we have a 10 high flush draw. Like most of the draws, I guess, are not to the nuts, but there's a lot going on with the hand that's going to enable us to call a lot of turns and call a lot of rivers.
Yeah, I agree. I think it could go either way, but this is definitely a cool hand just because we did talk about this in the beginning of the series in the first couple episodes, how you were working on checking back more flops, and I think this is an iffy one, but a good spot to consider a check back. It's like a nice strong hand to have in your check back range, given that you can call pretty much any turn, maybe any turn, and make plays on a lot of rivers. You also don't want to avoid getting a lot of money in against stronger draws. So this is a nice hand to keep the pot small with, where your flush draw could be dominated, and you don't want to build a big pot and run into a higher flush. And even though you can call check raise, it's not really pretty. So I think this would be a cool spot to check back, but also a fine spot to bet, given that you do fold out some better hands and have a lot of equity against them, even if they do call. Either's fine, but I just think people should be aware of the reasons for betting or checking. And as it turned out, he folded, which is a fine result. I guess that's it for the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We get through a good amount of interesting hands there and hit a few concepts.
Yeah, that's gonna be it for episode 4. Tune in for the next episode of PLO.
Thanks, guys.